skepticism, consciousness truly experiences itself as internally contradictory. From this experience emerges a new form of consciousness which brings together the two thoughts which skepticism holds apart. Skepticism's lack of thought about itself must vanish because it is, in fact, one consciousness which contains within itself these two modes. This new form is therefore one which knows that it is the dual consciousness of itself as self-liberating, unchangeable, and self-identical, and as self-bewildering and self-perverting. And it is the awareness of this contradictory nature, the self-contradictory nature of itself. In Stoicism, self-consciousness is the simple freedom of itself. In skepticism, this freedom becomes a reality, negates the other side of determinate existence, but really duplicates itself and now knows itself to be a duality. Consequently, the duplication which formerly was divided between two individuals, the lord and the bondsman, is now lodged in one. The duplication of self-consciousness within itself, which is essential in the notion of spirit, is thus here before us, but not yet in its unity. The unhappy consciousness is the consciousness of self as a dual-natured, merely contradictory being. Paragraph 206 is now introducing us to this new shape of consciousness, what Hegel is going to call the unhappy consciousness. Here we go. The unglückliche Bewusstsein, right? And this is going to occupy, working this out, much more of this section of the self-consciousness portion of the work than the skepticism did, or Stoicism did, or indeed even the master-slave dialectic or the beginning part of self-consciousness. This is really the most important part of this entire portion, self-consciousness. Why? Well, we're going to see a lot of playing itself out in the later sections, ultimately in the religion section. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. In this paragraph, he's charting a kind of progress that's taking place. He begins by talking about the contrast between skepticism itself and this new shape that's happening, but then he's going to bring in Stoicism as well. So, he starts out saying, in skepticism, consciousness experiences itself as internally contradictory. So that's part of where skepticism was heading to, right? He says, from this experience, you get a new form of consciousness which is going to bring together the two thoughts which skepticism holds apart. So skepticism is not able to reconcile the connection or the difference or the contradiction between these two sides. The unhappy consciousness is going to attempt to do so over and over and over again by a whole variety of means that are going to be quite interesting to watch and to connect with historical phenomena. So, he says, skepticism's lack of thought about itself must vanish. Why? Well, skepticism got itself to a certain point. It realizes the contradiction. It realizes even that this contradiction lies at the nature of self-consciousness, but it doesn't see any way to get past this. So long as you stay there, you're stuck with skepticism and you can't move any further along the dialectic. So he says, what's the key thing here? It is in fact one consciousness which contains within itself these two modes. You have two different ways of seeing the same thing here, and that determines whether you stay at this stage of skepticism or move to the unhappy consciousness. What does the unhappy consciousness bring to the table? The knowledge that this is part of the contradictory nature of consciousness. And then that's going to move further beyond that. So he says, this new form is therefore one which knows it is the dual consciousness of itself. Consciousness of itself on this side, on the universal, consciousness of itself on this side as the empirical, as who I am, as an actually existing human being. What are the attributes of this? Let's start actually on this side. I know the text goes first into the other one, but let's do that. So he says, this side is self-bewildering and self-perverting. That's what the skeptic realized about their own empirical consciousness, their own who they are. So that doesn't sound very good, right? Now on this side, we have the good stuff, right? Like being self-liberating, unchangeable, self-identical. Does this start to give you any ideas about where we're heading? Keep that in mind as we go through this. So he says, what we saw in Stoicism was self-consciousness is a simple freedom of itself, a freedom that's coming through thought. It negates the other, the world, the life. It has some problems with that are going to lead into skepticism. In skepticism, this freedom, he says, becomes a reality. It totally manages to negate the other, the side of determinate existence, but then it duplicates itself and now knows itself to be a duality. And he says, consequently, the duplication, which was formerly divided between two individuals, what does he mean there? The master-slave dialectic. In self-consciousness, as we saw, the awareness of the two self-consciousnesses, the struggle for recognition, they are in unequal positions in relation to each other. It looks like the Lord or the master has the upper hand for a while. It turns out the slave is the one who's developing. We saw that Stoicism just kind of nullifies that relationship. It doesn't matter as far as the Stoic is concerned. The skeptic is not really concerned with the master-slave dialectic per se either, but instead with this bifurcation that's happening within consciousness itself, kind of being two people, one of whom is a hyper person, a super person, and the other one is the schmuck that we happen to be at any given time, right? Now he goes on and he says, the duplication of self-consciousness within itself, which is essential in the notion of spirit. This is why this is so important, why the unhappy consciousness is so important. This duplication doesn't just happen in terms of society and the person who gets to be in charge, the person who's the universal, and then the rest of us poor bastards down here who slave away or work or have to, go and clock in at our job or do whatever, right? It's not just about, say, YouTube and us content providers, or pick whatever you like, right? It's also happening within every one of us as a person. We contain multiple aspects, each of which has its own determinateness, each of which has its own dynamism, which can conflict with each other, which can take cues from each other. This is a whole understanding of human being that's being implied here, as well as of society, as well as of historical development, the dialectic, spirit itself. He says this duality is inherent in the notion of spirit itself. So you're not going to, Hegel is indeed, in a certain respect, a monist, right? There's a totality, we're all part of this grand totality. But for a monist, he's one who's, sure dead set a lot on showing us duality within the monism. Duality running through duality, through duality, through duality, all this splitting, all this self-othering, all of these then connections that have to be restored and asserted. So he says, the duplication of self-consciousness is essential in the notion of spirit. It's thus here before it, but not yet in its unity. For skepticism, this awareness, this experience of the duality is something that anguishes it. It's a problem. For the unhappy consciousness, it also is the same. It is feeling this as a kind of anguish, as an estrangement, as an alienation. But it's also a problem to be solved. Because it's aware. It makes this into a central issue. It's aware of this being part of its nature. And it's going to try to overcome this in some way. So he says, the unhappy consciousness is the consciousness of self as a dual-natured, merely contradictory being. Now it's a challenge to try to address. This unhappy, inwardly disrupted consciousness, since its essentially contradictory nature is for it a single consciousness, must forever have present in the one consciousness the other also, and thus it is driven out of each in turn in the very moment when it imagines it has successfully attained to a peaceful unity with the other. Its true return into itself, or its reconciliation with itself, will, however, display the notion of spirit that has become a living spirit and has achieved an actual existence, because it already possesses as a single undivided consciousness a dual nature. The unhappy consciousness itself is the gazing of one self-consciousness into another, and itself is both, and the unity of both is also its essential nature. But it is not as yet explicitly aware that this is its essential nature, or that it is the unity of both. Having introduced the unhappy consciousness in the previous paragraph, Hegel is now going to point us towards a sort of general structure and where we're hoping to go with the unhappy consciousness. And it's important to keep in mind the very last sentence, the very last phrase that he's talking about here, where he says that the unhappy consciousness is not as yet explicitly aware of its essential nature. It's aware of how it is in many respects. We'll get to that in just a moment. But it's not aware of its essential nature, or that it is the unity of both modes of consciousness. It's going to engage in a kind of over and over again forgetting. Now, at the same time, it is aware, although it doesn't have well worked out knowledge at each point, about this splitting, this disruption as he's calling it here, or if we want to use another word for it, alienation, which is occurring within consciousness itself, and also by way of the projection, as we're going to see, of consciousness onto the world, onto that which is beyond the world, into something that will become a kind of God. Now, he starts out saying this unhappy, inwardly disrupted consciousness, since its essentially contradictory nature is for a single consciousness. It is aware, at some level, of its unity. It's aware as a unity that's not aware of itself as a unity. It's aware generally in an affective way, or a way using images rather than conceptually. He says, it must forever have present in the one consciousness the other also, and thus it is driven out of each in turn the very moment when it imagines it has successfully attained to a peaceful unity with the other. So we have this disruption, this bifurcation, this splitting that's taking place into the one consciousness, the essential, the unchanging, and the other consciousness, the empirical, the contingent, the self-bewildered consciousness. Each one of them has the other consciousness in some way within it, and there's a back and forth between the two of them engaging each other that is supposed to bring about some sort of unity, right? And the trouble is that this unity, every time that it seems to happen, is also therefore annulled. It's like always slipping away, like something that's greasy and you're trying to get a grip on it, and you keep on pushing it further and further out of your reach, right? Now, where this is supposed to be going is towards some sort of reconciliation, towards some sort of thing that's a unity, but a living unity, right? He says, its true return into itself, or its reconciliation with itself, that's going to happen way further on, towards the end of the section, and indeed, not even in this section, but in other sections to happen later on. He says, it will display the notion of spirit that has become a living spirit. A spirit that has this duality within itself, and is yet not becoming a contradictory conflict, a chaos within itself because of that. He says it has achieved an actual existence because it already possesses as a single, undivided consciousness, a dual nature. Where we're headed with this is the grasp that things that appear to be simple and unified have duality within them, as the very nature of the kind of things that they are, including ourselves, including our consciousness. But we're not yet there. He says the unhappy consciousness itself is the gazing of one consciousness into another. So each one of these consciousnesses is something that has agency, is something that can even believe itself to be a separate consciousness. How is this going to play itself out? Well, we're going to see that there's going to be a kind of, like I said, projection where the one consciousness gets pushed outside of the empirical human being, and the human being then gazes into it, relates itself to it, and yet there's also this gazing back, which is only possible because it's the unhappy consciousness that's really doing all of this. If we think about this in terms of worshiper and God, for Hegel, the God is not something totally separate from us. It's going to be something which is what we are, because we are this unhappy consciousness. We mistakenly identify ourselves with just this when actually we're both sides of it. Like he says, the unhappy consciousness itself is both, and the unity of both is also its essential nature, but it's not yet conscious of that unity. How will it become conscious of that unity? That's going to take some work. Since it is, to begin with, only the immediate unity of the two, and so takes them to be not the same but opposites, one of them, that is the simple unchangeable, it takes to be the essential being, but the other, the protean changeable, it takes to be the unessential. The two are, for the unhappy consciousness, alien to one another, and because it is itself the consciousness of this contradiction, it identifies itself with the changeable consciousness and takes itself to be the unessential being. But as consciousness of unchangeableness or of simple essential being, it must at the same time set about freeing itself from the unessential, that is, from itself. For though it indeed takes itself to be merely the changeable, and the unchangeable is for it an alien being, yet it is itself a simple, hence unchangeable consciousness, and hence it is aware that this consciousness is its own essence, although in such a way that again it does not itself take the essence to be its own. The attitude it assigns to both cannot therefore be one of mutual indifference. That is, it cannot be indifferent towards the unchangeable. Rather, it is itself directly both of them, and the relation of the two is for it a relation of essential being to the unessential, so that this latter has to be set aside. But since for it both are equally essential and contradictory, it is merely the contradictory movement in which one opposite does not come to rest in its opposite, but in it only produces itself afresh as an opposite. In paragraph 208, we're now seeing yet more of the structure of the unhappy consciousness being laid out. And this is really saying a lot of the same stuff that we just talked about with the last paragraph, but it's putting a particular twist on it. It's becoming a bit more specific, a bit more determinate, and it's coming to an important conclusion at the end. I don't want to skip to the conclusion. We'll come to that in a moment. The conclusion, by the way, doesn't really fit into this schema quite so well. That fits more the other stuff that we're going to talk about. So he says, the unhappy consciousness is only the immediate unity of these two, right? The universal consciousness, which is simple, unchangeable, is essential being, and then the empirical consciousness, contingent, self-bewildering, problematic, all these sorts of things, right? There's a splitting that's taken place between the two of these, right? So that each of them is indeed its own thing, but they are both encompassed within the unhappy consciousness, because the unhappy consciousness is what is conscious of both of them and through both of them. So it says it is the unity of the two. It takes them to be not the same but opposites. It places them in opposition. One of them, the simple unchangeable, it takes to be the essential being. The other, the protean, it comes from this guy Proteus, who had changed into a whole bunch of different things. Protean and changeable are really the same thing. It takes to be the unessential. Now, the question is, where does the unhappy consciousness identify itself? It is both of these. right? And it also is the unity or relation between the two of them. But how it identifies itself at the early stages and throughout most of this section is going to be on this side with the empirical consciousness, the changeable consciousness. Why? Well, in part because it doesn't yet have a grasp on the essential, and this is the part that is seeking out a grasp on the essential through some sort of relation by having consciousness of the unchangeable being. So its own, you could say that the unhappy consciousness's own understanding of this aspect of itself is coming through the relation between this part of itself to this part of itself, or the way this part of itself grasps this part of itself. And so the unhappy consciousness identifies itself with the changeable, unessential, contingent, empirical consciousness. As unhappy consciousness, I identify myself with this guy right here in 2015 with, this amount of beard, wearing this tie, and so on and so forth. Right? Why does it do that? Because this is the way it can become conscious of the other side of itself. So he says the two are, for the unhappy consciousness, alien to each other. So I should actually put alien down here. They are other. They are foreign. All these words are ways of saying the same thing. Friend. They don't eat the same way. They don't see things the same way. They have to go through sensitivity training to not, bruise each other, you could say, right? They are alien to each other. So this is all still within the same person, within the unhappy consciousness. He says, because it is itself the consciousness of this contradiction, that's another reason it identifies itself with the changeable consciousness. The changeable consciousness is the part that's kind of screwed up, where he said, yeah, I don't have it all figured out. I kind of wish I did, but some of this is confusing to me. And the confusion must be on my side, not over here with this bit over here. This is where the answers lie, and if I could just figure out how to align myself, my screwed up self here, with this wonderful, eternal, essential, unchanging, add whatever other divine attributes you want, being, totally rational being, everything would make sense. Not like my totally messed up, contradictory, only makes sense for a little while life that I'm living here. Starting to sound a little bit familiar? This is an important aspect of the way in which many of us live. So Hegel's describing something here that is, in certain respects, very essential if we want to play with words. So he says, although it takes itself to be merely the changeable and the unchangeable is for an alien being, it is itself a simple yet unchangeable consciousness. So at the same time, it's also grasping this. So the philosophers will also be saying, hey, what about the eternal in you? What about the essential in you, right? And the person down here would say, well, I don't really know that I have any of that in me. I want to get to that. So he says, it's aware that this consciousness is its own essence, although in such a way that, again, it does not itself take the essence to be its own. So this is the unhappy consciousness, but a kind of bar, a kind of forgetting, a kind of repression is taking place here that keeps the unhappy consciousness from being able to recognize that it is this, that it's seeking on this other side of itself. So he says, the attitude it assigns to both cannot therefore be one of mutual indifference. It cannot be indifferent towards the unchangeable. Rather, it is itself directly both of them and the relation of the two, for it is a relation of essential being to the unessential, so that the latter has to be set aside. But since for it both are equally essential and contradictory, it is merely the contradictory movement in which one opposite does not come to rest in its opposite, but in it only produces itself afresh as its opposite. What he's talking about there takes us a little bit beyond the problematic as I've sketched it here. as these two interact with each other, you notice that we've got a relationship here, a consciousness of unchangeable being. We could also put the action of seeking, or of sacrifice, or of attempting some sort of connection with that which is essential, trying to leave itself behind and connect up with this. What is the relation of the essential being to the changeable consciousness? That's to be determined in these later parts. And as this back and forth occurs, we're going to see, like I said, that metaphor of you're trying to reach for something and it's kind of slippery, and every time your fingers grasp it, it pushes itself a little bit further away from you, and so you're constantly chasing it. That's what this section gives the impression of occurring. Through all of these different ways by which human beings try to connect themselves as the screwed up, bewildered, unessential, contingent creatures that they are, with something that's bigger than themselves, something that makes sense, but at a distance, something that is essential, that keeps on slipping out of grasp. And they try this, then they move on to the next thing. Interestingly enough, and I'm going to close by saying this would not necessarily have to be confined to just the examples that Hegel is going to give us as we go through the next paragraphs and all the way to the end of this section. We could think of this occurring in our own much more secular time, in a lot of other ways in which people try to align themselves as the individual, the contingent, with that which is transcendent to them, something that is greater. Hegel would say that the same sort of dynamic of the unhappy consciousness actually being all of this at the same time would run throughout this entire dynamic, even if it happens to be a non-religious, a secular way of doing that.